Good morning, students. Yesterday, we were looking at monks, right, from the chapter 3 orders, and we had seen that, yes, clergy was very important along with the knights, and we now are looking essentially at and rather discovering a remarkable similarity between how the religious structure in India worked and or rather has been working and had been working for thousands and thousands of years, and also the great similarity in the conditions which we found in 11th century and 12th century, like that. And when we started with monks, of course, and we saw that yes, clergy was important. There was a whole and a full religious bureaucracy in Christianity in Europe at that point in time, whether you had the church, but there was also a very a sizable segment of the followers who did not go into the complete institutional church kind of system, and then and who living within the society and interacting with hundreds of people within the society. They would rather prefer to live in seclusion, have their own abbeys and their own monasteries, and they were the ones who were known as monks. Nothing surprising there, because in India we've also had a similar kind of thing, whereby we know that we had a certain amount of religious faith system and followers who were about temples, which could be located right in the middle of towns and cities. But also at one point in time, we would also have the great rishis and munis who would be living a life of seclusion in ashrams in some jungle wilderness, or somewhere in the caves and somewhere in the mountains, completely detached from rest of the society. So it was not something which was unusual, what we were seeing in Europe at that point in time, because we had been practicing it for thousands of years. So monks is done, of course, but I would like just to talk a little bit about this Benedictine monk working on a manuscript woodcut. This is something if you can remember this image or the sketch, it would come in handy when we are actually looking into the chapter of printing, because this is the earliest form of how the when they used to especially work on the scriptures, that is what was. And then when they used to copy the books, because in those times there were no photocopies, Xerox machines, of course, so everything had to be copied by hand. For the benefit of, say, for example, Bibles, it had to be written so that it could be circulated in different churches. Now, Benedictine monasteries, why are they important? Because they happen to be the earliest. You know, uh, the sixth. They have been around since 6th century, so just about 600 years after Jesus Christ. So they happen to be the oldest institutional form of monasteries, which of course started in Italy. Okay, and the people and the members and the monks of this monastery, and this the Benedictine form of monastery, were essentially known as black monks, because their uniform was, they used to wear complete total black robes. Okay, and if you want to get into the details of it, there are certain very interesting points here. Permission, which actually give an insight into the kind of life they lived. That is, permission to speak should rarely be granted to monks. Just imagine, it was all silence and silence. I wish we could have it today. Humility means obedience. No monk should own private property. Then definitely they were leading a very frugal life, just managing with bare essentials and devoting rest of the time in the service of humanity, or praying gods or reading their scriptures. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, so friars and sisters would be occupied at certain times in manual labor and at fixed hours in sacred reading. And the monasteries should be laid out in such a way that all necessities be found within its bounds: water, mill, garden, workshops. So essentially, all this done to ensure that you do not depend on the outside world for anything. Everything could be homegrown, everything could be managed within the boundaries. There was no need for any kind of interaction with the people from outside. That's what essentially was being attempted, and that's what was the purpose of the real purpose of those monasteries. Okay, so the church and the society. Though Europeans became Christians, though Europeans became Christians, they still held on to their old beliefs in magic and folk traditions. Christmas and Easter became important dates from the 4th century. Christ's birth, celebrated on 25th of December, replaced an old pre-Roman festival, the date of which was calculated by the solar calendar. Easter marked the crucifixion of Christ and his rising from the dead, but its date was not a fixed one because it replaced an older festival. Essentially, students, it is trying to tell you that though Christianity came and spread in different parts of Europe and Mediterranean, the people of those areas did not completely give up their age old, centuries old traditions. Students, you have to understand, when you read about great Alexander the Great and the great Roman emperors, Julius Caesar, and all those kind of people, all those rulers were there before the birth of Christ. Okay, so Roman civilization, Greek civilization, essentially the civilizations which were European in nature, and of course they did spread to different parts of even Asia, but they were very, very old civilizations. So it is impossible, you can yourself guess it, that they would not be praying to gods and goddesses, and they would not be spiritual just because Christ was not born. It is impossible. So they had their own set of gods and goddesses. The Greeks and the Romans, the Greek gods like Apollo or Zeus, they were very, very powerful gods, and they were very popular gods. Hades. Now, if you talk about the Roman gods would be Diana, Venus, uh, 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 Jupiter. They were very, very powerful gods, and they had their own gods. And naturally, when they had their own gods, they had their own spiritual beliefs, they had their own practices of religion, and they used to have their own way of doing it. And when Christianity happened, that is after the birth of Christ, of course, they embraced a lot of new things which Christianity had to offer, and the followers of Christ had to offer. But at the same time, it would be impossible for them to sacrifice everything. It would to come to come with a completely clean slate and relinquish everything, and just burn everything, their own respective age old beliefs which their fathers and their forefathers had been following again for centuries. So those practices also remained, and they were fused with the new form of Christianity and their practices. That's what this is essentially trying to tell you. Pilgrimage was an important part of a Christian's life, and many went on long journeys to shrines of martyrs or to big churches. Something which we also do it all the time. You visit Vaishno Devi and Amarnath, and you go to Tirupati Balaji and Dakshineshwar in Calcutta, and so many others, probably Goddess Kamakhya in Guwahati. Now, what are these things? These are essentially, and of course, people in Uttarakhand do Char Dham Yatra all the time. What are these things? What are these things? Essentially, they are, you go on a pilgrimage on these sites and these places of worship which you consider to be very sacred, very important. The third order, peasants, free and unfree. Okay, let's start it today. Peasants held their farms as tenants of the Lord. The men had to render military service at least 40 days every year. Peasant families had to set aside certain days of the week, usually three, but often more, when they would go to the Lord's estate and work there. The output from such labor, called labor rent, would go directly to the Lord. In addition, they could be required to do other unpaid labor, Services like digging ditches, gathering firewood, building fences, and repairing roads and buildings. Besides helping in the fields, women and children had to do other tasks. They spun thread, wove cloth, made candles, and pressed grapes to prepare wine for the Lord's use. There was one direct tax called taille that kings sometimes imposed on peasants. The clergy and nobles were exempted from paying this. So, students, we can understand that we have seen it already, that these manorial towns and these manorial campuses were really towns in themselves, where people who lived in these campuses barely had any interaction with the outside world because they were too busy minding the states of the nobility. Okay, and naturally this is just being, if the men were working in the field doing the hard work, also acting as part-time soldiers and doing all that kind of really the thing that involves sweat and toil and blood, naturally women were not sitting idle. They also were doing their best to contribute in whichever way they can, and so did the children, because you have to understand that there were no schools within those campuses naturally. So the children had to also to do something to be productive and help in the in the earnings of the family. So that is how it was. Okay, thank you.